Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is Dr. David Reedman. I am the creator of the K-12 School Shooting Database. On a couple recent episodes, I've had emergency physicians, hospital directors, trauma physicians talking about kind of the mechanics of patient care, the impact of firearm injuries on pediatric patients, some of the things we can learn from broader public health to apply to reducing gun violence. But a paper that I saw a preprint of recently is a much more policy-driven and strategic approach to the way that emergency medical systems respond to school shootings, or more broadly to mass shootings or active shooter incidents. So the preprint of this paper, which is pending peer review, is the earliest medical response to active shooter incidents. And with me today are the three authors of this paper, Dr. Dominique Wong, Dr. Clay Young, and Dr. Beth Thompson. They are all at Cabell Huntington Hospital in West Virginia. Dominique, could you please provide a little more info on your background? And we'll go around the horn here to get a feel for who's going to talk and why your message is so important.
Great. Thank you, David. I'm Dominique Wong. I've been an emergency physician for almost 30 years now. I practice in Huntington, West Virginia. And over the course of my career, I've gone from direct patient care to considering other ways that emergency medicine can be applied to our world. In particular, my interest is emergency medicine in the context of Homeland Security. And part of that is medicine is applied to law enforcement. We work closely in the emergency department with our law enforcement partners, and there's sort of an organic relationship there, though not necessarily a formal one. Some of my other roles, I'm a co-facilitator for the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security Executive Leaders Program. I'm the chair-elect for the American College of Emergency Physicians Tactical and Law Enforcement Medicine section. And just recently, I'm an at-large board member for the International Association of Chiefs of Police Police Physicians section.
I'm Beth Toppins. I'm also one of the ER physicians here at Cabell Huntington Hospital. I'm the ED medical director, and I've worked here for the last 23 years in emergency medicine. Some of the other hats I've worn over the years included being a regional EMS director. I've stepped back from that role since, but now becoming a little bit more involved with Dr. Wong and her hands-on community education for law enforcement in our area.
I'm Clay Young. I'm also an emergency physician, closing in on 30 years of practice. Have also had directorship of an air ambulance program, and have also been involved in the police training with Dr. Wong and the city of Huntington.
And for our listeners who aren't familiar with all of my background, for 18 years, I was a firefighter and EMT. And I also was a part early in my career of a effort within FEMA to identify a process called resource typing across the country, which was going to be standardizing different types of either people or equipment. And one of those was defining what would be a rescue task force, an EMS task force, a paramedic unit, because we do not have national standards for emergency medicine across the country. A paramedic in one state might be able to administer a whole host of drugs that are not available to a paramedic in another state. And in a third state, you might have all those same drugs, but they have to consult with a medical director who is within that state. And if you take those three paramedics and all send them to a fourth state to respond to a disaster, they are not all the same units and the same capabilities. And so we actually, things that seem standard across our country were not, have not, and unfortunately, this multi-year project did not solve a lot of those fundamental issues. So what we talk about today is a lot of terms like you hear rescue task force or tactical EMS or medical response to an active shooter incident. That is something that has a different procedure, different sets of people in every jurisdiction across the country. So I imagine that is part of what brought you to this paper.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and you can add to what you have experienced already the fact that there are not a lot of national standards for policing either, as far as policing training requirements and things like that. So, what's the saying? If you have worked with one EMS system, you work with one EMS system, and the same goes for policing. And honestly, the training for both self and buddy aid or active shooter medical response is also pretty disjointed at times. So part of the goal of this paper and some of the other work we do is to make the most evidence-based but police-oriented medical recommendations possible. One thing that is uniform across the board is that we know we have better outcomes if we can give direct critical medical care within the first 10 minutes and definitive care within 60 minutes. And that's definitive care to an operating room or interventional radiology suite, not to an ER door. So we know those things. We know the leading causes of preventable death in active shooter incidents. And then we know the police context. And now we can add the medical skills and training that are needed for non-medical personnel to that group of facts and come up with something that is relatively simple. You don't have to worry about causing harm if you do it incorrectly, because these people are, police most of the time are non-medical people. It's not too resource intensive for someone to purchase the equipment for their police officers. It's not too big a bundle of equipment for the officers to carry. And yet it can absolutely and has absolutely saved lives.
And these are not, new findings that you have. Your paper is a really empirical analysis of a broad number of incidents. But I think it's been very clear, especially since the Aurora movie theater shooting, that police officers providing immediate care in a place where either EMS is not able to access the scene or you have a limited number of EMS units compared to victims, there were quite a few folks that were saved by law enforcement medical intervention. Can you kind of talk through that incident a little bit to frame this discussion for the audience?
There's actually this started back when I had, at the time, 2 medical students who are now in residency work on 2 separate active shooter incidents that they picked themselves and looked at the earliest medical care. And Aurora Century Theater shooting was one, and the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was another. And they're both really interesting cases to look at. So the Aurora Theater shooting is one where they had, technically, a tactical medic responded really quickly, a TEMS officer. That is probably more a coincidence. He was working as a police officer and happened to also be the TEMS medic. So he was working at the time as an officer, responded within a couple of minutes, as most of the time police do, and was able to get in there and get to work. And then as the chaos ensued with not knowing what was going on with the situation, a lot of people fleeing the studio or the theater, and difficulty, of course, in a chaotic situation, communicating between EMS and police. A lot of the casualties were just loaded in police vehicles. A decision was made to do that. And the majority of the most critical victims arrived to the hospital in police vehicles. EMS did see a lot of casualties, but they weren't the most critical casualties. So police made that, made that decision, and rightfully so, transported those people and got them there in a timely fashion. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was similar. There were some, of course, delays in communication. And then when the responding police department arrived, they were able to use their own first aid training and their own medical kits and handled all of the casualties for the first 30 minutes. There was a Thames medic that was able to respond, but Thames is not designed to respond to active shooters. So it was a matter of somebody responding after 30 minutes because of a systemic problem, because of the way the Thames is designed. In the meantime, Rescue Task Force is there, and Rescue Task Force was not able to gain access because the situation wasn't deemed warm zone for them to be able to get in and access casualties. So again, police responded medically to almost all of the casualties at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas as well. I think maybe a definitions would be helpful. So Rescue Task Force is a system where everybody in that EMS agency has the right PPE, body armor, helmets. They're typically not armed, and everybody in the agency is trained in this. They respond to a warm zone where the threat isn't imminent, but it's also not deemed a safe scene. And they do that with police escort. So it's a lot of moving parts, but in general, if you can get an ambulance there, like a regular EMS response, you have a Rescue Task Force member there. TEMS, on the other hand, are tactical, typically medics and above, medics and physicians. Often they're armed. Their mission is to back special operations. So an agency may support one or two TEMS providers, and that could be an EMS agency, it could be a police agency, it could even be a hospital if they support their docs to do that. But the whole agency isn't trained on TEMS. They have a much higher level of tactical training. They typically can respond everywhere that police can respond. But again, their primary mission is not to respond to active shooter incidents.
One of the other definitions that we might want to throw in is what we actually defined as medical care by law enforcement. Kind of with the after action reports, one of the things that we use as a marker of medical care would be, yes, direct medical interventions such as tourniquets or chest seals, but also extrication time. So it's a shift from their law enforcement mentality to victim response. So we included that in extrication times and transportation to the hospital as well.
And I think two more definitions to add for folks that are not in emergency services is people use kind of EMT and paramedic interchangeably. Technically, they're both within the EMT family, and there are different levels of EMT. So who you think of as an EMT is an EMT basic. And that's somebody who's understands kind of advanced first aid skills. They know how to splint. They know how to perform CPR, use an automatic AED, not a manual AED, and they administer a couple of drugs, which are generally drugs that people can buy off the shelf or they're already prescribed, and they're not drugs that can really cause a tremendous amount of harm if they're given incorrectly. And your standard ambulance across a lot of the country has somebody who's been in an EMT class, and that's somewhere in the usually 140 to 160 hours of training. A paramedic, which is a EMTI, which could be intermediate for a bridge, or an EMTP, which would be an EMT paramedic, is usually somebody who goes through an 18-month to a 2-year program, very similar to the level of knowledge and care that a nurse would offer. So they can start IVs, they can insert airways, they usually have dozens or more than 100 drugs that they can administer, some of those with or without medical direction. And some of those, like paralytics, could kill somebody if they're dosed incorrectly. So that is more or less a pre-hospital nurse and advanced medical provider. Within that, a tactical medic could be somebody who's an EMT, could be somebody who's an EMTI, could be somebody who's an EMTP. But regardless of their level, they usually don't have the same equipment that you would have in an EMS transport unit. because that entire ambulance, every compartment of it is packed with lots of different equipment. And that tactical medic in their police car probably has one bag where they have some IVs and some airway supplies and so on. So just putting that out so that people can understand that these terms are all very different. Now, in terms of that medical response, where you're saying at Aurora, they just got people into a car. At Marjorie Stoneman, you got somebody into a car. What's the difference kind of in terms of medical treatment that would happen 5 minutes in the back of a police car versus 5 minutes in the back of an ambulance? And why does that not really matter?
Well, to clarify, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, they did a lot of they did the majority of the early medical treatment. They did a lot of extrication, but the transportation was primarily by regular conventional EMS. And so there are studies, quite a few good, solid studies that show for critical victims of penetrating trauma, so gunshot wounds or stab wounds, the least time in the field equals the highest survivability. So that, and frankly, that just goes directly to get them there in any version, in any way that you can. The longer the delays in the field, the lower the survivability. It's specific to that one situation, though, critical victims of penetrating trauma. It's not held true for like blunt trauma or car accidents, things like that.
And that aligns with, I don't know if this is still taught, but one of the first lessons in the EMT class that I took in the early 2000s was a simple calculation of the load and go time. So if you're a basic provider, you're on the scene, you have a critical patient, you see how long it's going to take for the medic unit to get there, and you see how long it's going to take you to drive to the hospital. And anytime your time to the hospital is shorter than the time for that unit to get there, you make an immediate decision that you're just going to go to the hospital, because then they are getting definitive care in the same amount of time that they would get field care. And it seems like throughout this paper, that's one of the kind of takeaway lessons with getting somebody rapidly to a hospital by any means possible.
Yeah, absolutely. With the state of the hospital system, there certainly are going to be shades of gray for this. So if you're in a rural area and you are in a trauma desert, which are increasing across the country as hospitals consolidate, then, and you have access to other resources like pre-hospital blood, then I don't know that we can make an entire general blanket statement across the board. But it is certainly something to add to the considerations when you're arranging what you're going to do, or if you were on scene for something, you can add this consideration in if you have delays in EMS. To your point about the basic, EMT basic versus the paramedic or the EMT advanced or whichever level happens to be in your state, what we have come to see as we've over the years of training police is that that many of the things that need to be done are really at the level of what a basic would do anyway. So can a police officer do the same skills? And there are several studies, anecdotal studies, that show that police are very capable of doing some of these basic medical skills. And in our experience, we've seen that with the right training, that they can do the basic medical skills that we need them to do and do them correctly. And even if they don't do them on the exact right patient without that big, without an extensive medical background, there is actually very little harm that they can cause with the things that they need to do.
And what are those critical skills for an officer to do if they are there on the scene and they come across a critically wounded victim?
So, I mean, some of the simple ones are like tourniquets and chest seals, and then just packing wounds. And then sometimes there's things like people are knocked unconscious and they're just in a position where they can't breathe, and just getting them into a position where they're halfway prone to where they can actually unblock their airway. Those are simple things that can be done that are life-saving.
There were two really good studies, or actually three really good studies, that looked at the causes of preventable death in active shooter incidents. So the leading cause of death that is not preventable is a gunshot wound to the head. But from there, when we look at what could be victims who could be saved if we do everything just right, the leading cause of preventable death is non-vascular chest wounds. So that requires a simple vented chest seal. It peels off like a Band-Aid, you stick it on the hole, and you're done. So there's obviously more things you can do if the situation becomes more critical. But again, we don't want to give skills to someone who doesn't want to do medicine, isn't trained in medicine, doesn't have the hours of experience you need to do it correctly. So we stick with those skills, and vented chest seal is very easy to carry. It's about $14 worth of equipment, and you can very comfortably be trained in that once a year and still remember how to do it when you need to.
And the whole package is like tiny, fits on their police vest very easily, containing what they need.
Yeah, from what we had seen through our training is there's very little downside to this. One, the officers themselves are very interested in this training, not only for an active shooter situation, but it's been applied in multiple situations that we've seen trauma in our area that the police have put tourniquets on. Even recently, we had a couple of very severe arterial injuries from a dog bite that they appropriately placed tourniquets on due to the training that they had received. They are very realistic that this could involve them, it could involve their partner, and so they're very invested in learning these basic skills. And like Dr. Wong said, it's not that we're trying to turn them into medical providers, but the equipment is cheap enough, it's small enough, and it's easy enough to use with just limited practice and education that there's really not much downside to encouraging forces to use it.
We really don't see a way around it either. EMS has seen safety requirements. They are an asset, and they need to be preserved as an asset and can afford to go into an unsafe scene. Police are there, and they have to be able to cover that gap between the point of injury and the initiation of medical care. So if there were a way around it, that would be wonderful for everybody involved and everyone could stay in their lanes, but unfortunately that's not possible.
Well, I think there is a growing level of evidence that there is a need for a paradigm shift for rapid treatment of victims above all else, because from my study of about 240 active shooter incidents at schools and then studies of mass shootings in public spaces, most incidents are over before the first police officer even arrives. Most shootings end on the shooter's terms with either suicide or fleeing, or they're subdued by bystanders there on the scene. So it's very rare for any police officer to be the one who ends an active shooter and thus deeming the scene safe. So at that point, I think in any kind of science-based practice, you deal with knowns and you deal with unknowns, and you're never going to pass a known to possibly deal with an unknown. So if a police officer enters a building, it is very likely that the shooter is either gone or dead or subdued, meaning there is no risk to anyone. It's also extremely rare to have a second shooter in a building. So if that police officer comes across a critically wounded victim who has already been critically wounded at this point for probably anywhere from 2 to 4 minutes when that officer arrives, you only have 6 minutes left before they need to be arriving at definitive care. So why would a police officer bypass that victim to go search a building for somebody who's either gone or dead? That doesn't make any sense. So you hear over and over in this old paradigm or the current paradigm that, police are going to ignore victims. Police are going to step over victims. Police are going to go until they can definitively say that there's no threat anywhere in this building, that every single closet and boiler room and crawl space and ceiling and basement has been searched. then we can finally say that it's safe for EMS to be involved, or maybe your rescue task force has arrived 30 minutes after that. In reality, there are opportunities to save people. There's a teacher and a student who bled to death in CVPA High School in St. Louis. The shooter was already dead in a classroom on the opposite side of the campus from them, and they were alive for at least 25 minutes after the shooting started. But they were not removed from the school until 40 minutes after the shooting started. That was a incident where 2 people died who likely would not have died with different procedures.
A surprising number to me was if you look at the amount of time in the cases that we reviewed for law enforcement to shift to the medical care. In about 47% of those cases, they were providing care or what we deemed as care within 10 minutes. If you expanded it out just a little bit to 15 minutes, they were hands-on doing medical in 68% of the cases that we looked at. And that was a little surprising and impressive to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have a chaotic, confusing situation, and yet they were able to flip a switch and understand what needed to be done next. You bring up some good points. The point about, is there going to be and I believe you've done a lot of work on this also with, is there going to be a second shooter? Is there a chance of an explosive element? Is the shooter still in the building somewhere, and how thorough a search do you need to do? And I think these are conversations that need to be had with law enforcement as far as expressing the urgency of the medical need. Certainly, it's difficult to tell an agency with a medical goal in mind that this is what they should be willing to risk. But it is a conversation worth having with police leadership.
And that goes along with also defining what scene safety is, because that is something that is different from incident to incident. As somebody who was on a EMS unit and a 2-person EMS unit in my teens and 20s, going into some relatively dangerous neighborhoods and areas in the middle of the night, I've been on a chest pains call and had been on the second floor apartment in a garden apartment style building and heard a shotgun blast out front. And then now you're dealing with a shooting. So there's inherent danger on every EMS call. In the fire department, firefighters are killed every year searching vacant buildings just for the sake of searching a vacant building during a fire. Why is it that during a mass shooting or a school shooting, when absolutely innocent victims, often children, are in the greatest risk possible of dying in the next couple minutes, do we say there cannot be any possible risk to any of our fire or EMS responders? That goes against the standards of every other type of incident. And I think that kind of can fit into this swarm concept of, in lots of ways, people go and kind of emergently take action in a lot of spaces rather than having a defined system like this task force of these people need to be here with this equipment, and then get the incident commander to start waving his orange flag before we can start taking action.
Yep. So there's a difference between reality and policy. I was the medical director for a small EMS agency in the center of our state, and they had an incident. And it was after the incident had calmed down, and the paramedic had a bullet hole in his shirt that he hadn't realized, that how close that was. Even a car accident, on the side of the highway, they're putting themselves in danger all the time. Just like in the ER, there's a lot of violence now against providers. So these are risks that you take all the time. On the other hand, from a policy point of view, sending somebody in to an area where somebody is actively looking to harm other people. And we know what data we've had so far and how shooters respond. We don't know what they're going to develop in the future as they learn and modify and change their ways to have better impact as well. And from a policy point of view, to say that, hey, this is a tricky situation even for police, you don't have any PPE, you don't have any body armor, you don't have a helmet as a conventional EMS provider, and we're going to send you in there. What comfort level do we have that, what percentage is there a second shooter? What percentage is there where there's an explosive? And what percentage risk are we willing to tolerate before we send someone with no training and no PPE? So those are some of the things you think, typically not even a firearm, right? Now, Rescue Task Force is designed to have the PPE, but not the tactical training. So in theory, it was a great idea if you could coordinate with police and get that all done in a really short period of time. And that's the devil's in the details there. It is, when you read through these after action reports or when we, in our simulations with police, it is about impossible to get a clear story, good information, accurate information in 10 minutes time. So that's obviously going to be an issue with your rescue task force effectiveness. On the other hand, would we force this? Do we need to force this issue about risk taking when we have an option? Which, again, when we see any of these active shooter incidents, we see a lot of police officers arriving. And if every police officer is trained with the same mission about early medical care and rapid extrication, then we may not need to push the envelope on sending people without PPE and without tactical training into that, at least that dangerous situation.
And I think about a lesson from the fire service. It was a very simple change across how a lot of incident commands operate, is that often incident commanders would lose the sense of time in a building fire. And when you lose your sense of time, then you don't realize how the incident priorities are changing. And that's something that doesn't exist in the police department. And if police officers were constantly emphasized that critically wounded victims need to be moving towards definitive care as quickly as possible, and they need to be arriving at a facility ideally 10 minutes after they were shot, if the dispatcher, in addition to giving information, was giving a running time from the shooting dispatch, so that everybody is constantly thinking, wait a second, there are a dozen of us on the scene, we haven't heard gunshots in the last few minutes, we've been searching, we haven't found anybody, but we've got 6 people that are shot in the lobby of this building. If you're hearing communications to responding officers, you're 6 minutes into your incident, victims have 4 minutes to ideal transport. That takes 5 seconds for a dispatcher to say, and you could quickly be moving people towards thinking about, wait a second, maybe all 12 of us don't need to be looking for the guy who's probably dead or fled. Let's go ahead and get some of these victims moving towards the hospital.
Yeah, you touched on swarm intelligence, and that's something I've been considering as kind of a model for the way police work. So I had the privilege of being able to work as a tactical physician for a short period of time. And it, in a way, the way police work in an active shooter situation is similar to how we work in the emergency department. And I'm sure how you work when you work with a good team in EMS. Everybody has a role. Everybody knows the role. And everybody knows the common goal. And in the middle of chaos, people are moving quickly, but they rely on each other. And that system seems to work really effectively. So when you have an active shooter situation, again, I'm not a sworn officer, but they all work very similarly. And you can see in case after case, they don't even have to work from the same agency if they have the same principles. So they can work together. They work. If there's a stimulus, they're going to respond a certain way. If there's no stimulus, they respond another way. They don't have an outside commander telling them what to do specifically. They don't for every step of the way. I would love to have a discussion with police leadership of, can we roll the medical side into this as well? So it's in their system. It's in all of the boots on the ground, responding officers system to add this in to their, to their response systems. Again, with the same goal of we have to do this to save lives. So.
And I think it does take a commitment, like you said. If you think about just the hospitals themselves, I mean, we practice MCI or mass casualty events for a reason. Even though that's what we do every day, there are things that are areas of weakness that you can improve on. And it is something that would take a commitment from the agencies themselves to do this on a regular basis, to remind them as a non-medical provider how to do that in a stressful, time-sensitive situation. So we look at it as basic, medical, first aid, but for someone that doesn't do that every day, it does take some refreshing and like regular practice.
And it's also about empowering your frontline people to bring forward the problems that they're seeing. And that's either going to be from real incident responses or from a full-scale, realistic training or exercise. Your frontline people are going to see the flaws in the system. And it takes a long time for institutions to learn and change, especially things that become kind of national standards and mandates. But in the 1970s and 80s, there were a lot of firefighters who were being trapped in building fires, and they were all inside, so there was nobody to rescue them. So a policy was made in the 90s through the 2000s that once firefighters go in, there need to be 2 people out. This followed the OSHA standard for 2 out in a hazardous situation. And then if something went wrong, those 2 out would affect the rescue. That looks great on paper until you look at how it works in the real world. The 2 out are probably the 2 most junior people or the ambulance crew. How are you going to have your 2 least experienced people have to do the most complicated and dangerous rescue of an entire crew of more experienced people during, the start of a fire when you have a catastrophic collapse or a flashover? Looked good on paper, didn't make any sense in the real world. So then the policy response to that was, let's have a rapid intervention team, which is an engine, an advanced life support medic crew, and either a heavy rescue or ladder truck crew. They are going to assemble, and they are going to be there as the experienced crew to respond on the scene if somebody's trapped. That's great. But the RIT dispatch came after the first fire dispatch and the working fire dispatch. So you have units that are 10th due to your emergency responding, and by the time they're there on the scene and geared up, you're 20 minutes into an incident. If you look at the data from house fires, most firefighter deaths from either flashovers or building collapse happen in the first 5 minutes on scene. So we come up with these policy solutions, they get implemented. The RIT, Rapid Intervention Team, has now been implemented for 20 years. There's no recorded case of a rapid intervention team ever making a critical rescue on a building fire, even though they're common across the country. I saw so many parallels to that in your study of the rescue task force. Great on paper, great in training, great in a controlled environment. But when it comes down to it, if they get there half an hour after the incident starts, when most of these are done in 2 minutes or less, you're not having any impact on life-saving.
Yeah, you bring up so many excellent points here, right? The system has been in place now for decades, and it's time to look and see whether it works with just frank honesty. Rescue task force can be resource intensive for an agency. You have to buy all the PPE to coordinate training. Number one, among every one of your EMS providers is hard enough, but now to have to coordinate training with every one of the police officers as well from a responding agency. Those things get to be very resource intensive. And again, these are roles that your everyday EMS provider and everyday police officer are going to be the ones addressing. So every officer and every EMS provider has to be trained in rescue task force. And then when you look at how well they work, we not only looked at the data and the response times, we also took some of the narrative out of these reports. And they were pretty consistent, saying that it was just difficult to say a scene is safe in 10 minutes. So when you actually exercise these or listen to any of the recordings, the chaos is incredible. And so you can see that that really does seem to confirm that 10 minutes is too short a time to get correct information that they need. So like you said, although the system sounded good and everybody wants to do something, everybody wants to nobody wants to be powerless in these situations. They want to protect their kids. It seemed like a nice option. It doesn't require your providers to carry firearms. You don't have all that sticky mess and liability of somebody who's not tactically or law enforcement trained carrying a firearm, or the the ethical issues about a medical provider carrying a firearm. So like you said, on paper, it seemed like a good idea. I will say before we jump to conclusions, so Rescue Task Force had difficulty accessing the point of injury in a lot of the cases where they were available. And they had the longest average response time. But what we also noticed in our paper was we tapped into a lot of incidents, but there weren't after action reports available to review for a lot of these. And of the ones that were available, there wasn't medical data consistently. So rather than say, scrap your rescue task force, I think the best message we can say with this is look at it hard based on the issues, the challenges that Rescue Task Force have seen. Number two, we need more data. You do a fabulous job gathering data. We are flying blind. We need more data to be able to make conclusions. And so those were kind of two of the takeaways. Consider your resources, and we need more data.
And Dr. Young, were there any critical points from this that you think could be kind of immediately implemented at just about any agency across the country?
I think the big one is like early involvement of the police in medical care and extrication, and I like the idea of training them for the simple interventions that they can do. And like we were saying with the rescue task force, they weren't there in under 10 minutes, not once. And the police were there averaging 8.6 minutes, or right around in there. And that's I think the best thing that we can do right now to medically respond to these is get the police involved early and get them involved in getting the patients out of there. Yeah. And like you said, redefining, what's safe and what level of risk we're going to take, because certainly, I think Columbine also had a teacher that died that was in the room alive for maybe an hour even. So totally savable, but that was one of the first ones and they didn't, know how to respond to it.
Yeah, there's a heartbreaking documentary on the Santa Fe high school shooting that happened 2 months after Parkland. And there were two teachers that were hit with a shotgun in the hallway. They were some of the first victims, and they both were critically injured right by the door to the school. And the woman was laying directly across from her coworker, and she was calling her husband saying, I need help, as numerous police officers ran right past her, because it turned into a barricade that was eventually the student was talked out of the room. But meanwhile, about 20 feet away, as 100 officers are there, she is just looking at her coworker, and she watches her coworker just slowly bleed to death and die there. And then ultimately, this woman is not taken to care by police, but it's her husband who drives around the barricades, drives onto the campus, and ultimately drags her to the staging area where the EMS units are. So the last point, which Beth, if you could add anything to, is if a civilian is around, in a building or a school or wherever when a shooting takes place, what can you do as a civilian that can help somebody who's critically wounded? It's certainly not going to hurt them in any way.
Right. There's a reason that there's been a big push recently to try to get educators and church attenders to learn Stop the Bleed and things like that. There's a reason that they really have tried to even educate elementary school students in signs and symptoms of stroke, because they spend a lot of time with their grandparents. So the big thing is to try to get some education in the hands and minds of the people that are going to be on the scene the quickest. And in 100% of these cases, law enforcement is the first people to arrive that are capable of providing this life-saving treatment. And again, expanding to community as far as like Stop the Bleed training and that sort of thing is an excellent resource as well. And this is not trying to take away anything additional that's being done with the Rescue Task Force or Stop the Bleed or community training, but just kind of put a little bit of a spotlight on something that seems to be common sense. Let's get some education, some very reasonable skills in the hands of those that we're certain are going to be in these situations the quickest.
Yeah, and I think reminding kids and community members that if you're in a bad situation, you can save somebody, that you don't need to be helpless there. Back to that shooting at Central Visual and Performing Arts in St. Louis, where the teacher and student, bled to death in the classroom. There was a student who was shot in his torso and through both of his arms, and he dove out of a third-story window, broke both of his legs, and then other students were able to drag him to safety. And he survived and lived from that. If he had, stayed in that classroom, he probably would have certainly perished. So, by any means possible, if you can get people away, if you can get critically wounded people away to the scene, flag somebody down, get them in a car, get them in an Uber, do whatever you can. And I think for EMS and for the Rescue Task Force, what we've seen more and more at recent school shootings is that the kids are self-evacuating, including the wounded ones. And at Evergreen High School in Colorado this past September, while EMS units were staged, there was one of the wounded victims he was critically wounded and he went into cardiac arrest, but he'd been taken by students to a community center that was about a half mile from the school. And the other critically wounded victim was out at a street corner on the far north end of the campus. So those were critically wounded victims that have been evacuated by other students. They're out of what would be considered the hot or the warm zone. Meanwhile, the shooter was also running around the campus looking for a police officer to kill him. So it's complex situations, but in complex situations, simple plans don't work and very rigid structures don't work. So I thank you all so much for writing this paper. I hope that it's something that can really push the boundaries of the way that we're thinking about emergency medicine. Hopefully this podcast can be something that gets people talking within their agencies, because ultimately it's agency leadership and it's activism within communities that drives change. So Dr. Young, Dr. Toppins, Dr. Wong, thank you all so much for your time and work on this topic. And when the paper does come out, maybe we will all reconvene, celebrate its publication, which is an onerous process, and hope that these lessons can save lives in the future.
David, I really want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to get this message out as well. We've done a lot of work on understanding the best way to save lives. And as being the first responders to receive these casualties, we would prefer if we never saw another preventable death from an active shooter incident in the hospital again. So thank you again for the opportunity.